Alors, rebonjour. On va commencer à l'heure pour finir plus ou moins à l'heure. Voilà, donc I will switch back in English. So hello everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ariel Dougherty. As a filmmaker over 5 decades, Ariel Dougherty has been a leader in the independent and feminist film and cultural communities. Teacher, producer, and mentor, she has encouraged hundreds of women-directed films to completion and to reach a wide and varied. In 1969, Ariel co-founded Women Make Movies, which was incorporated in 1972. Now it's the globe's largest distributor of women's film and one of the most self-sustaining organizations to emerge from the women's liberation movement. Amongst other important initiatives, and Ariel, you have done so much amazing stuff. I'm sorry, I have to summarize it here. While being development director at Women's Studio Workshop in Rosendale, she curated their program, Women's Work in Film and Video. She also co-led creation of a women's media policy in November 2011 at National Council on Women's Organizations. Currently, she is completing a book about 26 contemporary girl, women, lesbian, community-based film teaching programs, with a look back to the parallel projects from the 1970s. She will now talk about community-based feminist film teaching in the long 70s. We will have 10 minutes of questions at the end of her presentation. Ariel, the floor is yours.
Merci. Bon après-midi. Pour moi, est avant la heure. Thank you for this honor to present the concluding keynote address of this colloquium. It has been exciting to see familiar points of feminist teaching through new eyes, as well as to learn about so much more. The many horrors of COVID have forced us to amplify our communications technologies. There are important lessons here in how, through this new reach, we have actually expanded the ability of many more people to be engaged, even though we are not able to be with one another face to face. That indeed is loss. A major caveat in my lecture, the majority of my references will be to the United States, where my work has centered. When referring to non-US data and information, I will state so. Foremost, I want to emphasize that community-based media teaching for women and girls is international in scope, though my focus has largely been US bound. The Deccan program in Pasatur, India is one of my favorite programs. It serves poor rural women farmers. When Deccan started in the 70s, its goals were sustainable development, inclusion, and participation. VP Satish, the director, states, when later we analyzed the impacts of globalization on the poor, we added market autonomy and autonomy over media. We started using video and then radio. Mostly it is women making films. Women collaborated, for instance, to make a film to show where a canal should go. By age 10, Mayuri here has already made several films about principles of farming from her own unschooled elders. She has just returned from Indonesia when this photo was taken, presenting her documentaries to delegates from various countries gathered to discuss climate change and crops. Making these films and radio programs have given women stature in this community. Ann Jones, author and photojournalist, found the same thing to be true about gender, about greater respect for women. In 2008, she ran a 4-nation series of photography workshops in Africa for the International Rescue Committee. Called Global Crescendo, the project's main aim was to give voice or vision to women in conflict zones. Girls who mastered technical tools gained community respect. They were able to visualize their concerns and tell their own stories from their own points of view. Speaking with their photos was a central part of the project. This was something we also carried through at Women Make Movies. In humans, our visual perception is the most developed or heightened of all our senses. Babies see their world, recognize the important people in their lives long before they formulate words. Heavy emotional lessons are visually absorbed if we see our father strike our mother. So in a world where almost the totality of filmic images are the constructs of white Western male thinking, power relationships, dominance, male interactions, and masculine fantasies, so to see many views of women by women is radical and radicalizing. A feminist goal, in the words of Madeline Lim, the founder and artistic director of Queer Women of Color Media Arts Project, is global domination. In the US, when the women's liberation movement began to flourish in the 1970s, at women's centers especially, all kinds of women's teaching programs emerged. Auto mechanics, karate classes, silk screening, just to name a few. The range of such women-taught skills for sister women was vast. For those of us who were artists, teaching other women was intuitively natural. Such new feminist cultural programs emerged in many venues, initially where we were already working. A space of women's art, among the many feminist cultural entities, the Women's Building and its myriad of programs are best known because they are best documented. A cadre of women building participants actively created histories, videos, and books about a decade ago via Otis College. The videos are available on YouTube. Women's building programs actively used video in their consciousness-raising processes. This CR was the core of the Feminist Studio Workshop teaching. Video recordings of events was a central component of their work. Feminist art critic Lucy Lepard called the Women's Building, quote, the capital of cultural feminism, end quote. Lucy, who's actually a close family friend, knows very well the plastic arts, but not the media arts. The actual teaching of video production in its own right came a bit later in 1976 under a new affiliated group, the Los Angeles Women's Video Center. LAWVC was founded by Nancy Angelo, Annette Hunt, and Candace Compton. Jerry Allen joined the collective a year later in 1977. Through 1980, video teaching workshops were offered in summer programs, extension programs, and within the Feminist Studio Workshop, a college accredited program. The video teaching centered around taping performances like In Mourning and Rage, and record companies dragged their feet. Various members participated in video letters, and there were some other productions like Nun and the Deviant. During the CETA, otherwise known as the Comprehensive Educational Training Act, contracts in 1978 and 79, the Los Angeles Women's Video Collective produced several PSAs, which were considered too creative by many of the people in hiring them, and 3 documentaries on different Los Angeles women's organizations. All total, some 350 videotapes existed in the Women's Building collection when the Women's Building closed in 1991. They were housed for almost 2 decades in a member's home. The tapes were literally out on the curb for trash pickup when the final word that Getty would take the women's building materials came through. Alex Hayes, who has written about these videos, says only about 50 of the tapes have survived the electronic degradation from their half-inch reel-to-reel format. Educational principles at the women's building were paramount. Jerry Allen in my interview stated, quote, "We were so about form and content, like looking at whatever you're doing, what's the most appropriate form for, and where's the most appropriate place, and based on who you want to reach. Sitting in a circle, it was a critical feminist equalizing principle. Sadly, something that's very hard to do virtually." In New York City, Susan Milano was tasked by Stana Vasuka to create a women's video festival. As the female half of the founding Vasuka couple of The Kitchen, the hotspot where video art first emerged in the US, at least on the East Coast, Stana was alarmed that women's work was not getting shown. Over the 7 days of this first festival, all of the 25 different works that were submitted were presented, bypassing any selection process. Among the attendees was Margot Lewitton, one of the founding collective members of the Women's Inner Art Center, a multidisciplinary art spot located in Hell's Kitchen section of New York City, way west on 57th Street. Lewitton snagged Milano to come and teach video at the Women's Inner Art Center. In her teaching, Susan underscored the temperamental nature of electronics in my interview with her. She said, "You had to be very mindful of the half-inch video quirks. As a result, all the workshop students did monthly equipment maintenance checks." Susan told me in the first program, we focused on atypical work situations for women. Lewitton joined the class. There was a woman who worked at TV Guide. A number of that first group were feminist activists. Ann Volks was also in that class, as was Tracy Fitz. Oh, and also Carolyn Kresge. These were all women that I worked with in video in New York City or showed their work. The Priest and the Pilot was the video they produced out of this first year. In 1976 was the last year Susan taught video at the Women's Inner Art Center, but all this time she was organizing, curating more women's video festivals. The last was in 1980. Wendy Clark, daughter of filmmaker Shirley Clark, taught next at the Women's Inner Art Center. From her classes emerged a series of dynamic installations. What's on tonight was, this is a quote from Susan, "What's on tonight was, in my opinion, the most wonderful installation ever put on in New York City that only a very few people ever saw." She went on to also say, in 1975, during the festival, we rescreened the first set of international video letters. At Women's Inner Art Center, we held these monthly screenings for about 2 years. That was one of the most innovative, amazing projects of the period. From 1969 to 1972, on the rubric of Women Make Movies, which we saw as a production arm of the women's liberation movement, Sheila Page and I produced 4 films. Our livings were through teaching youth filmmaking. A considerable perk we had was access to the editing stand-up moviolas on nights and weekends. Especially with our quirky 6-minute dramatic short, The Trials of Alice Crimmins, we went out into neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens to reach the public. When a distributor told us women are not an audience, Sheila and I decided it was time to bring our media teaching to women and distribute those films with women's visions. We had 2 purposes. One involved a broad range of community women to tell their stories in motion pictures. And 2, as a vital earned income program, knowing feminism would not always be fundable, established distribution to get women's cinematic stories out to a broad national, international audience. Jean Shaw on Making Fear told me, this was unique because it was something I had never experienced before, a real community, a real fellowship of women, a supportive environment. It was a community of people working on a task together to learn how to make a movie. I was told, well, the only requirement really to be involved is you have to commit to completing the film that you make. I had never created something out of my own experience and completed it. For every 3 women who came into the workshop, 1 would stay to make a movie. When possible, we reached out to other venues within the community, like the Mother's Room at the local public school, the image at the title card at the start of this presentation. With Stewardesses for Women's Rights, we co-produced a training video. We hoped at one point that our workshop might become the local community head-end station, expecting that public access on cable would flourish. That expectation of cable and vision never came about. In 1975, we reached out to the National Black Feminist Organization to involve them in a project as we had done with Stewardesses. Organizational changes by both parties ended this collaboration in 1976. The cover of this late 1976 distribution brochure reflects that hoped project. Sheila and I stepped down as co-directors, handing the organization to the women we had taught. With the completion that year of the first educational film, Health Caring, distribution took on a larger portion of the organization's time. By decade's end, teaching shifted to a series of skills building workshops to a growing group of activist women with social media concerns. In 1980, Women Make Movies decided to concentrate due to economic survival solely on distribution. The active membership was ultimately dismantled. Women did not know while creating our cultural activities in the 1970s that we joined the artist workforce 2.5 times over any other work. This is remarkable. This significant data, still little cited, came just at the time when the women's cultural funding was being curtailed at the national level. Women's funds failed to pick up the slack. For instance, the Ms. Foundation for Women had a policy not to fund women's media or women's culture. This vital time period created a significant historical cultural shift that can never be duplicated, at least not in the United States. But where is all that art making? What groups have survived till now? Which ones have maintained a radical purpose and still do community-based teaching? Janine Antoni, a mid-1990s MacArthur Genius Awardee, was in graduate school in 1989. Her professor noticed that her performance work followed in the footsteps of Carolee Schneemann, Anna Mandetta, and Hannah Wilke. Antoni ran off to her Rhode Island School of Design library. There was nothing there, nothing on any of them. I literally gasped when I learned this. Sadly, some art curators and academics have gotten a lot of feminist media history wrong, even attributing women-made works to men, or omitting the history altogether. Of course, there is regrettably a long history of this. Aren't some Rodin sculptures actually the work of Camille Claudel? Too infrequently documented, feminist artists, teachers get short shrift because we are wearing so many hats, working on institution building as well as teaching, plus trying to do our own work. The old boy reward system is too single focused. The DIY riot girl activities of the 80s and 90s were also significant in fostering girl-made media. I have not investigated this phase as it is more self-developed and individually driven, not organizational. It is important to note from the manifesto in Bikini Kill #2 that owning the means of production is essential to the creation of our own meaning. These are the same political concerns we had expressed in the 70s. Chico Luna was the media group to first blaze in my mind that there was a new march of young women film teaching programs. That was in 2006. I was enthralled that producing dramatic narrative works was their focus. Through their processes in pieces, I saw again my own film teaching experiences from the 1970s. Their signature F-word media justice film video program enabled Latinas to create their own film reels. Professionalism all the way, but with a community commitment to justice. Quote, they did a lot of work around privilege and internalized oppression, end quote, Lillian Jimenez, the media literacy teacher and later part-time director, reported in my interview with her. Lillian went on to say, Chico Luna's stature rose in certain communities because of the very progressive stand that they took as feminists and feminists of color. Excellent at promoting their work, they were the darlings of the funding community. A lot of young women went through that program. The budget was approaching $250,000. Then in 2008, the market crashed, the funding dried up. That end of quote. This once highly successful organization in spring 2009 was forced to close. This is not just. As Carly Beaumont, the former program director, told me, quote, running through Chico Luna and running through the F word there was this sense of family and community. We were really, truly there to empower women to lean on one another. That was the fabric of Chico Luna, end quote. When I initiated a deeper study into the contemporary girl, women, lesbian-focused community film teaching groups, at first I thought there were 12 or so. Today I found 26 throughout the US. I call it a movement. Just in the past weeks, I may have found a 27th. Already more than half of these groups have closed shop. But the films remain and are in need of archiving and preservation, which is way beyond the scope of my research. I do write about what I've been able to see. These films need to be collected and to be shown and enjoyed and studied too, as well as cherished. New groups still emerge because the need remains. Sometimes the groups are difficult to find because they are largely local, specifically serving their own community. Yet their purpose is universal. Making a film and telling a story visually is empowering, but the lessons girls are learning in these programs are more than making a movie. Girls learn leadership, they learn organizing skills, how to budget their time and manage resources. Most of all, they learn collaboration and teamwork. These are all vital skills they will carry into adulthood in any endeavor. The challenges are many. They start with money, money, and money. A leadership transition in these groups is especially hard because of the multiple hats a founder wears. Finding an appropriate mix of skills and drive and a new leader are very difficult. Time demands, when you have a part-time position, but politics and other issues demand more than a full-time effort. And then there's impact. pressures of scale, steps in development, outreach, and the organizational advancement growth in a teaching mode that does not lend itself to scaling up. COVID could possibly be putting some of these organizations out of existence, like what happened to Chica Luna after the market crash in 2008. The organizational pressure is huge, especially when the emphasis and impulse is primarily to teach. Administering such organizations demands a complex set of skills and persistence and capacity. The stress when money is so unavailable is great. An added component of this is the dynamic of being an artist, desiring to create your own work in addition to running an organization and teaching. It is very complex. This needs deeper examination and relief processes like staff sabbaticals. This can only happen with vastly increased funding, deeper sensitive academic study, and visionary development processes. When feminists discuss teaching in non-hierarchical ways, crafting teamwork and collaboration and evolving group consciousness, we must also examine the impact of mainstream dominant culture that promotes individual stars, the ranking of best, the competition model within capitalism, and how all of that mitigates against our efforts. The glorification of the individual over vital collective struggle needs serious examination. It is holding back the necessary change all oppressed people seek. A new generation of teacher leaders, Madeline Lim, Alicia Rascon, Tanya Akita, Paramita Vojo, bring a far more developed set of experiences and strategies to their programs. Their efforts and films that come out, and the films that come out of these workshops will impact more and more people. The combined effect of these films create a tableau of feminist vision. This work, if widely seen, can be an impetus for change over the next decades. Our job is to ensure these groups thrive and that the works get widely seen. Paramita Vojo, my sister feminist filmmaker and teacher from India, in an article she wrote, Separation Anxiety, says, push for the unverifiable veracities of creativity. Art becomes a meaningful political space only if it is emotionally available to people. And it is so only if it is a place where they can make meanings of their own, instead of merely consuming those that they are given. I say yes. Paramita continues. We need to allow art to fill us with a sense of possibility, the easier to imagine a different world and fantasize the details of how this world will be. In the US, the failure to struggle for media communications policy with a gendered lens might be the most serious misstep of the second and third wave feminism. As the US has no cultural minister post, there is no center point to address the myriad of media issues. Despite much cacophony of Hollywood women belatedly complaining about the piss poor behind the camera numbers, the exhibition of women-directed works is far worse. In the US, only 2.75% of screens show women-directed films. In the US, there is no national feminist group or coalition that expressly works on feminist media policy. This is so antithetical in a country where our major foreign export is commercial Hollywood cinema. We must support and build our feminist institutions, nourish them with recognition and money, allowing them to flourish and prosper, and build our collective strength through a network. The collective voice will be emboldened with visual, visionary content. This is central to women's and all people's autonomy, self-determination, and liberation. Our ability to control our own narrative, history, and future. As we dig deeper into our consciousnesses and intuitions and impact more girls at early stages in their development, we will be guided to the better, best sustainable collective commons. Here at the Whatnot Intergenerational High School is my 27th girl-centered film program. There is so much to learn and so much more to teach. Merci, merci beaucoup. And I have one last slide which shows, because this is being recorded, so this is documentation of how to find the background material. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariel. Thanks.
So I should stop sharing this, yes.
Well, thank you so much. It was very, very rich and so interesting. I have made a lot of notes, but I'm sure a lot of questions will be arriving in a minute. I was especially interested in what you just said about art as a political space when it helps people make meaning of their own. And I think the way you used film and filmmaking and you have teach filmmaking really shows perhaps a clear way how to do that. I have a question which actually is not that trivial. It is about the funding process, because you shown how much it was an important issue. And in your bio that you sent me, it says that for Lynn Hershman's film, Women, Art and Revolution, you raised a significant financial contribution. How did you do that? And was that very complicated?
Raising the money, one of the reasons why I got into being a development director is because you, as a filmmaker, you spend all your time raising money. And for Lynn's film, I've actually never physically met Lynn. We've done all our work virtually. And I joined her at a particular point in her project when she didn't have someone producing actively with her. And there had been a seminar in New York at the Museum of Modern Art, and I had heard that one of the board members of MoMA had funded a survey of all women's work at the Museum of Modern Art. And I thought about that and I thought she would be interested in this film. And so I dug up her address and sent her a request to come to a screening, which she did do. And ultimately, she contributed $100,000 to the production, which is quite amazing. And unfortunately, that kind of possibility does not exist every day. It should, but it doesn't. I just happened to, foresee that that was a possibility and acted on it. It's very hard.
Yeah, I can see that. I can imagine.
But one more thing about the money issue, which I think is sort of interesting, I've made a note from some of the other workshops. I don't think anybody else has really discussed money. And I think that is a problem that we don't address the economics of our situation sufficiently. I bring up the fact that the EU is in the middle of deciding, or may have already by now decided that all audiovisual money that's funded through the EU must be spent 50-50 for women and men. And that's been a long 5-year process. But that's unusual, that nothing like that is happening in the United States, nothing.
All right. Thank you for your answer. There's a question from Elvan Zabounian. Thank you so much, Ariel. This was wonderful. Suzanne Meislas' name appears as a photographer on several images from the 70s. How was the collaboration initiated, and was it important then to think of the visual archive as a trace for the future?
Susan Susan and I went to college. She was the class behind me. She had just come to New York after finishing her graduate school program, and I asked her if she would photograph these different production shots. You know, and this was still several years before she even joined Magnum. So it's somewhat coincidental on some levels. I don't think we were aware of archiving very much. You know, in fact, the images that I use of Susan's, the very first one I dug up from Der Spiegel, because they had used it when I had presented some films in Berlin. And then the brochure, the first Women Make Movies fundraising brochure has features that photograph in it. And I'm sort of in the throes of trying to get Susan to dig up the negatives and make some new prints.
Okay. Kathy Deepwell says, do you think there is a natural cycle of growth and development in women's collections, collective groups?
I'm very excited about what I see going on collectively for women today. It's quite amazing. I think, you know, that is, I hope, a really important extension of feminism in the women's movement. You know, we'll see what comes on the other side of that kind of activism, but there's just a tremendous amount of group creative work going on. You know, if it weren't for women's collectives in Chile, the plebiscite that just got voted on wouldn't have happened, I don't think.
Okay. And all of those groups, do they know each other? Is there communications between the groups?
The contemporary groups? I don't know. Of my film groups, a little bit. I helped encourage some of that. I don't think some of them were aware of each other. There are some that are more simpatico than others. But I think that to make a bigger impact funding wise, they need to I would think they need to form a coalition, but it's just very hard to do things like that. You know, capacity is a big issue.
Of course. There's a question from Sunny Buick. Thank you, Ariel. They saved the best for last. Thank you for mentioning Bikini Kill and DIY. Yesterday, dilettantisme was the dirty word in the 20s with women artists in Germany. We must continue the revolution now more than ever. Your voice is very inspiring.
Thank you.
And a question from Marie-Dominique Gill. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was absolutely amazing. I would like to ask you about feminist film teachings in the women's land or in Kate Millett's The Farm. Could you tell us more about the archives of these very particular organizations?
Gosh, you know, I don't know too much about it, but I happen to have a neighbor here in my funky little town, Truth or Consequences, who worked with Kate on the farm. So I'll investigate and find out more. I just don't know. I mean, they were neighbors even of the Women's Studio Workshop, but we didn't have very much interaction in the 80s and 90s.
Okay, I don't know if there are any more questions. Yes, Camilla Cook. Wonderful to see you, Ariel, and thank you for this great talk. Can you talk more about how you work with creating your own archive of these important activities, and perhaps speak more to the idea of us women filmmakers being in charge of creation of our histories, and how this may work in a contemporary scenario?
Very good question, and I the archiving is difficult. To be perfectly frank, there are not very many available sites for archiving. I mean, I was fortunate and I put my stuff at Schlesinger Library at Harvard. There are two other good women's archives, and while I talk about them, the importance is that they all offer grants to go do the study, which I think is significant. One is at the Sally Bingham collection at Duke, and the other is the Smith collection at Smith College. It's very hit and miss. I have bumped into, I mean, Susan Milano is now very busy sort of archiving the work from the video festivals and everything. And there was a link in one of the slides to somebody who's working with her on that and building a website that will show a lot of that kind of material. In the list of all the video groups from 1975, there is one group called Love, Lesbians Organized for Video Experience, and their members have just recently put up a whole collection of their work on Vimeo. But it's, you know, finding out what's going on, and it's very piecemeal. So I think that one of the lessons that we need to learn is that producing, exhibiting, distributing, archiving all need to be married together in sort of the process of what we're learning and how we do our work. And I, as someone, I'm in the middle of trying to preserve some of my own films, and preserving them on film is the critical thing, not digitized. So one of the things we have to be concerned about is whether digital will hold up in the long run.
Okay, thank you. I think there's no more questions and time is running up. So thank you so much, Ariel, for a great keynote and a great way to end our symposium. I will just have a few words of conclusion, and if the chairwomen would want to log on their videos to accompany me, that would be nice. Hi. You're there. So I will not really conclude on such a broad subject, and moreover on a subject which needs so much more visibility. I feel we are still at the edge of a huge research space, and this is quite exciting. Nevertheless, the different papers we heard have made some point quite clear for me, and I would like to share them with you. First of all, when facing the teaching of art in general, we often lack archives. Teaching has long been depreciated, and in the case of women teaching, the depreciation is even more obvious. It even sometimes contributes to the devaluation of a whole range of practice, as for crafts or textile work. Any work on women pedagogy seems then to ask for an unlearning process, as Terry Wolverton would say, or at least for a new approach on seemingly mundane hierarchies. Few artists like Teuber or Gego have produced texts on pedagogy. As a result, we need to find alternative sources for our work. And I found, listening to all of you, that the relationship between women artists and their students is usually a good place to start. These relationships may take different forms, such as close friendships in the case of Kate Kollowitz, group dynamics and family-oriented space in the case of Isabel Waldberg, and more generally in the examples we saw. Solidarity and a particular attention to voice and silence, as Marischke Appelmann pointed out, are key to feminist teaching. Humor can also be used as a powerful tool leading with subtlety to more empowerment, as filmmaking can also be, as Ariel Dougherty clearly shown. This leads me to underline a second pattern we saw emerge during this symposium. Personal life, subjectivity, and even intimacy constitute a field within which we may think afresh about what transmission is and what it means specifically for women artists and students. Taking into account subjectivity in this way also leads towards a new understanding of what a network can be. We saw the importance of role models in Tunisia. In the case of Nathalie Magnan or Denise Scott Brown, but also I think a lot of the women artists we talked about, the closeness, sorority, and solidarity went a long way for their students and can be considered as important parts of their teaching. In this way, we arrive to the third point I wanted to make. In seeing the personal as political, feminist artists and teachers allow for a new kind of sharing and caring. Amongst others, Elsa Stansfield at the Van Eyck Academy and Lygia Clark at Saint-Charles and Sancier have experienced the group as a comforting, safe space. Their work also points towards the importance of returning to the body as the primary site of knowledge. And this was made quite clear in the case of the feminist art program. To conclude now, really, after thanking yesterday the three big institutions who came together to organize this symposium, I want to say a special thanks to all of the people within these institutions who worked behind the scene, or the scenes. David Fourcault and all the communication staff of the École nationale des chartes, Manuela Danescu and Eleni Pantelaras from AWARE. They will continue to work on this symposium since we plan to publish videos of the panels as soon as possible. Now to all of the speakers today and yesterday, thank you so much for your generosity in sharing such invigorating and exciting research. Have a good afternoon and hopefully see you soon. And Elvan wants to say something. Elvan, on t'entend pas.
Yes, Cathy Dipwa wanted to share this information, if you can, to advertise to the essay competition on feminist art in an international curriculum. So I don't know how to share this with, okay, Stephanie did it already, great. Merci Stephanie.
Right, so if no one wants to add something, I thought maybe Camille wanted to say hello. Or...
Non, mais voilà, je voulais remercier pour ces 2 journées qui me paraissent très importantes aussi par rapport à la période actuelle où ces questions de pédagogie, je crois, reviennent vraiment sur le devant de la scène et où effectivement ces pratiques dévalorisées, qu'on croyait sans archives, sans images, sans témoignages, justement peuvent à nouveau trouver, on peut trouver des nouveaux modèles pour travailler dessus et je crois que c'est ça qui a été démontré ces 2 journées, donc c'était très, très réjouissant. Voilà, donc merci à tout le monde, puis merci aux personnes qui ont participé, qui ont été présentes, qui ont posé plein de questions.
Merci.
Merci à toutes. Bonne journée.
Merci, au revoir.
Merci Déborah. Au revoir.
Au revoir. Au revoir. Au revoir.
Au revoir.